Hi, everybody. This is Rich Zwelling from Target Test Prep, and I am here to talk to you about a common question many of you like to ask, which is, should I switch to the GRE and is it even worth it? So stay tuned. We are going to talk about just that. So I get this question a lot from my students. You've been studying for a while. Maybe you're not getting the ideal result you want on the GMAT, and you're like, is it time for a switch? And is it even worth it? And one of the biggest things I have to combat, I think, is this idea that it's going to be some kind of sunk cost. Like you've spent all this time, all this energy, all this money on the GMAT, and I really want to stick to that because I don't want to go into a whole new test. Well, the good news is that all the skills that you've been kind of practicing and refining on the GMAT are going to apply to the GRE as well. So it's not a sunk cost. It's really just getting used to a new testing format. Now, there are a few other skills you're going to need to know to be able to take the GRE, but you're not losing anything. It's not like the stuff you've been studying for the GMAT is going to suddenly fall by the wayside. So let's also talk about why actually there are some advantages to switching to the GRE. Depending on what you're comfortable with, what makes the most sense for you, the GRE can actually be a good switch because unlike the GMAT, you don't have to answer the question right in front of you to get to the next one. You can actually go back and forth among any question within a section. And that gives you the advantage of not having to feel stressed when the clock is on you and you're like, oh my God, I got to answer this question. I'm worried about time. You can actually skip back and forth among questions. And that means that the test is adaptive by section, right? So based on how you do on the entire section, you're going to get a harder section on the next one, right? So there are two quant sections and two verbal sections, in addition to the essay at the very beginning. And on the quant and verbal sections at the beginning, you get just 12 questions. And once you do those 12 questions, which are going to be maybe at an easier medium level, maybe one or two hard ones thrown in the middle, if you do well on that, you're going to get a harder set on the next 15. So the second quant and second verbal sections are 15 questions each. And that's what you want because you want to be able to actually get that higher score. But it's so nice that you don't have to worry about the question in front of you all the time. You can skip to the very end if you want to. On the first quant section, if you wanted to go to question 12, boom, you can do that. And then you can come back to other questions earlier. And that presents a new strategy element as to what type of questions you tackle first, which ones I can leave behind till the end. Time management, that's going to be a little bit of an adjustment, but it could be a big advantage because you're not so stressed by the question right in front of you at the moment. Okay, now another advantage to the GRE is that for the most part, the quantitative material is a little bit more straightforward than it is on the GMAT. That being said, one of the things you're going to have to consider is there is still a score that you want to get if you want to get into, for example, the best business schools. The best business schools have a median quant score of about 163, and that is out of 170. So 170 is the highest you can get. 160 is about the median. Same for verbal. You're talking about a 163 out of 170. So knowing how you're going to get to that score can be helpful too. And we do have some videos that you can click on that show you how to do well on these sections. So I talked to you before about all the skills that you learned on the GMAT kind of being translatable. And what's the difference then? Because I did say before that on the GRE, there is some other stuff you're going to need to know. Well, on the verbal side, you are going to need to know some vocabulary. So they are going to test you on some more advanced language. And that's easily, fixable by just studying some vocab every day. It's not as big a deal as many people make it out to be. If you study a few vocab words every day and let that build over the course of weeks and months, you're going to actually have a bigger vocabulary. And that's going to help because some of the harder questions are not just about complicated vocabulary, but it's about picking apart the logic of the sentence, much like you would do on a critical reasoning question on the GMAT. And by the way, critical reasoning is still on the GRE, right? Reading comprehension is still on the GRE. So all those skills you learn on the GMAT, again, still translatable. Okay, now when it comes to actually expanding your vocabulary, another thing that can really help is reading regular publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, things like that. If you want to do economic passages, which are good because sometimes they throw econ in there, you've got The Economist, you've got Bloomberg, right? Fortune, stuff like that. For science, you've got Scientific American and Discover. And you've also got Smithsonian Magazine if you want a nice catch-all of kind of everything going together. So just picking one article each day on a topic that you're not familiar with or not that interested in is a good way to kind of expand your vocabulary and your overall critical thinking skills. Okay, now on the quant side, one of the things that you'll have to know that you didn't need to know before if you've been doing the GMAT recently is you need to know some geometry. Now, TTP has everything set up for you so that you can learn all the necessary geometry material, but it is tested more extensively on the GRE than it is on the GMAT. Now, that shouldn't be anything that should dissuade you from going to the GRE because, like anything else, it's just another skill. But knowing all the material you need to know from TTP is going to really help. Okay, so to actually get a little bit more specific about this and show you kind of the relationship between the GMAT and the GRE and how it's going to be easily translatable, I thought we would look at an example. So let us go ahead and do that right now. So here we are, and this is a GMAT question, and it is a data sufficiency question, as you've probably seen before. You've got a prompt at the top, you've got two statements, and you've got the 5 answer choices that we know and love. So if you've done the GMAT, you're no stranger to this. And I want to kind of work through this problem, even though it's a GMAT problem, because after we're done with this problem, what we're going to do is do something very similar on a GRE quantitative comparison problem to show you that it's much the same kind of thinking, and it's not going to be anything too new. So take a moment to try to do this problem on your own. You can pause the video, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the solution. Okay, we're back. So let's talk about this problem and how to pick it apart. So if you look at the prompt at the top, you'll probably notice that it's a good idea to form an equation. We know that Carl has both quarters and nickels, but if Carl were to add 12 quarters to his collection, he's going to have 3 times as many quarters. So we take the number of quarters, which we can call Q. We're just going to go ahead and add 12 to that. And we know that what we're going to end up with is 3 times the number of nickels. And we have to make sure we put that 3 in the right spot, right? We multiply the number of nickels by 3, and that's going to be 12 more than the quarters. And the question becomes, does Carl currently have more quarters than nickels? In other words, is Q going to be bigger than N? And I like to kind of write that out to let me know what I'm going after. And at that point, you might be saying, okay, well, what am I going to do with this algebraically? But sometimes with the problem, it's good to kind of brute force it a little bit and see where it goes and see if you can establish a pattern so you don't have to do any heavy lifting in terms of the algebra. Okay, so statement 1 says that Carl has more than 6 nickels. Great. So what that means basically is that the number of nickels is at a minimum 7. And I can put that there and ask myself, okay, well, if the number of nickels is 7, what's going to happen to the number of quarters? Well, I can off to the side say, okay, Q plus 12 is therefore going to equal 3 times 7 or 21, which would mean in this specific case, if I just subtract 12 from both sides, the number of quarters is going to be equal to 9. And I start to kind of map this out, make a little pseudo chart here, and say, all right, well, it looks like the number of quarters is bigger than the number of nickels. Is that always going to be the case? Well, if I repeated this process and said that the number of nickels is going to be 8, then I would get Q plus 12 is equal to 24, 3 times 8, and the number of quarters would be equal to 12. Now, I did say that one of the things you can do is brute force until you establish a pattern, because I notice here that the number of quarters is again bigger than the number of nickels. But what does that mean for me, right? Is it always going to be the case? Well, I take a close look at this, and what I notice is the difference between the numbers is growing as the number of nickels and quarters gets bigger. So I go from 9 to 7, and I notice that that is a distance of 2, right? And I go from 12 to 8, and I notice that the distance is 4. And what I begin to understand is that as the number of nickels goes up, the number of quarters is also going to go up, but at a higher rate. So the distance is always going to be growing between the two. And that's enough evidence for me to say, you know what? The number of quarters is always going to be bigger than the number of nickels. That is not going to change. So statement 1, I would say, is sufficient. And then I would say, okay, well, based on that, what do I know about the answer choices? The only answer choices that involve statement 1 being sufficient are A and D, which means I can go ahead and eliminate B, C, and E, and all of a sudden I'm down to 2. So the only thing I really have left to consider is statement 2. Now, it says that Carl has fewer than 8 nickels. Now, I'm going to be sneaky here because what I'm going to do is repeat this process, but I already did a little bit of the legwork, right? So I know that Q plus 12 is equal to 3N. Now, if Carl has fewer than 8 nickels, I already did 7. I know that if n is 7, then q is 9. So I shouldn't repeat that, right? That is already taken care of for me. But then what I want to do is consider the fact that, well, if Carl has fewer than 8 nickels, could be anything, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what it is, but it could be any number less than 8. And what if I did, for example, n equals 5, and I tried to make it a little bit more towards the minimum? Now, if n is equal to 5, and I got q plus 12 is equal to 3n, then that would mean q plus 12 is equal to 15, and that leads to q is equal to 3. And you notice what just happened here. I came up with a situation where, okay, well, in that first example, yeah, q is bigger than n, 9 is bigger than 7. But all of a sudden in the second example, q is less than n. I can't tell, right? It could go either way, which is enough for me to say, hey, it looks like statement 2 is insufficient. And I am done because that means that I can take out D, and I know that A is going to be my winner. So statement 1 is sufficient, even though statement 2 is not, and that is our final answer. Okay, so then you might be saying, all right, well, so what? That's a GMAT question. Well, now I'm going to show you how this is all going to come back into play when we do a GRE question. So here is the next example. Give me 1 second. All right, now you look at this and it's much the same question, but this time we've adjusted for the format of the GRE. So this is what's called a quantitative comparison question, where we get the same kind of deal. We get a prompt at the top, but now we have 2 quantities, and our job is to actually compare them. Is quantity A bigger? That's answer choice A. Is quantity B bigger? That is answer choice B. Are they equal? Answer choice C. Or like answer choice E on the GMAT, can I not tell? And that is answer choice D on the GRE. And you notice that it's going to be much the same thing. We don't have to rehash the entire problem here. But remember that we decided that if q plus 12 is equal to 3n, and in this case, we add the condition, you see, the way they switch the problem around a little bit, we have the condition that Carl definitely has more than 6 nickels. So if the number of nickels is 7, like we did before, we knew that q was going to be 9. And it's much the same thing as statement 1 on the last question. The bigger that n gets, the bigger that q gets, but at an even higher rate. We know that if n is equal to 8, q is equal to 12. And if I kept this going, just for the sake of argument, right? If n is 9, it would turn out that q is equal to 15. If n is 10, then q would be equal to 18. And again, we notice that the value of q is growing steadily, right, compared to n. The distance between q and n is always going to be bigger. And the only thing that's different now is that we're being asked to compare 2 quantities. Quantity A is the number of quarters that Carl actually has in his collection. Quantity B is the number of nickels that Carl actually has. And we see that quantity A, which we labeled as our q, is always going to be bigger than n, which is the quantity for the number of nickels. So in this case, the answer would be A. Quantity A is always going to be bigger. And this should hopefully convince you that it's not too different from the GMAT in terms of data sufficiency, right? It's just getting used to a new question format. And that's going to be a lot of what happens when you switch from the GMAT to the GRE. And yeah, that is hopefully it. Hopefully that makes sense. And if you're still considering and you want to know whether to switch to the GRE, we have plenty of videos. We have ones that involve getting better on quant. I have a number of videos that I've shot already on the different question formats. I also wanted to talk about the difference in the verbal section, because this is an example of the adjustment you'll have to make in the form for the GRE, where you have to do a little bit of vocabulary. And we notice that what we have here is a situation where you're given a sentence. This is called text completion, and you have different parts blanked out. And you've got to choose the most appropriate word. All right, so in this case, let's take a look, and I'll give you a little bit to try to do this on your own, and we will come back to discuss it. All right, so hopefully you found that not too difficult, but if you did, no problem. It takes a little while to get used to. But we go through the question, and it's partly about vocab, but it's also partly about the logical understanding of the sentence and what makes the most sense. So a person who single-mindedly obsesses over plot when watching a Godard film is liable to blank the more visceral aspects of its art. And you notice that, much like critical thinking on the GMAT, what this forces you to do is think about the logical implications of the sentence. So we know that somebody is obsessing over plot. Sounds like a bad thing, right? And what are they liable to do? Well, we're talking about the more visceral aspects of his art. And here's where the vocab part comes into play, because the word visceral tends to mean something that gets at your gut, right? It really hits you at your core. It's emotional. And so if I obsess over plot, which is something a little bit more cerebral, logical, then I'm going to miss the stuff that is, really gut wrenching, the stuff that hits you in the gut. So what am I liable to do? And sometimes you can even think of a word on your own that would make sense, right? Something like ignore. And I don't want to ignore that stuff, but I might do that if I'm obsessing over plot, which makes sense then to look at a word like neglect. Now, you won't always be able to nail down the first blank right out of the gate, but a lot of times you can. And you notice that it is as much about vocab as it is about logical reasoning. So the next part, to experience the film to the fullest extent, the viewer must maintain engagement with the imagery, even if it is somewhat blank or downright blank. Now, you notice that there is an immediate relationship between parts 2 and 3, which is that it looks like the first part is kind of a more mild version of what happens in the third blank, and the third blank is going to be more extreme. And what kind of word would I want to put in there? Well, earlier in the sentence, it says that we've got to maintain engagement. So because we have to maintain engagement, the latter part of the sentence says, that might be a little bit difficult. All right, even if it was somewhat, and we look at our answer choices here and we see what would make it difficult to engage with the movie. Okay, even if it was somewhat puzzling, sounds pretty good, right? That means it's a little bit confusing. Cerebral, which means that it's too much in your head, right? You have to think about it a little bit too much. Peculiar, which sounds like it's strange, right? Not quite what we're used to. Now, any one of these three could be appealing. And you might be saying to yourself, I don't know. I don't know which one to go to. But that's where the dynamic comes into play between mild and extreme. We know that whatever goes into that third blank is going to have to be a more extreme version of the second. So we can look at blanks 2 and 3 together, look at our options and say, which one of these presents that kind of dynamic? Now it says fathomable in blank 3. Okay, fathomable means understandable. Well, that's not really going to match because, first of all, I'm looking for something that would make it difficult to maintain engagement with. I don't like that. Gratifying, which means it gives you a sense of fulfillment. I like this, right? Also not very promising. But incomprehensible, which means I can't understand it, kind of like that, right? And at this point, it kind of drops into your lap if you're paying attention to that dynamic, because what is a milder version of incomprehensible? It is puzzling. Puzzling meaning, a little bit confusing, right? But incomprehensible, much more extreme. So it means I can't understand it at all. And these are the skills you're going to need to develop when you switch to the GRE. But it's not that daunting because it's many of the same skills you've already been doing on the GMAT. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. I hope that convinced you a little bit that switching to the GRE might not be a bad idea. Now, if you're trying to make up your mind, you can do some more research into the GRE. We have lots of videos for you on how to get better on quant or the format of the test, different things. And I have shot a couple of videos where I go through the different question types. And check out TTP for more details. And hopefully I will see you down the road.